The conference room at Walsh and Associates smelled like old leather and older money. My uncle Victor sat at the head of the table like he'd already inherited the throne, his wife Diane perched beside him with that same smug smile she'd worn at the wake. My cousins Marcus and Vanessa flanked them like sentries, all of them dressed in designer black that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood in the doorway holding Ruby's hand, her small fingers sticky from the lollipop the receptionist had given her. 5 years old and already she could sense when Mommy was about to walk into a battlefield. Isaac squeezed my shoulder, his teacher's salary suit looking shabby next to the Brooks Brothers parade in front of us, but I'd never loved him more than in that moment when he whispered, "We belong here. Don't let them tell you otherwise." "Well," Victor said without looking up from his phone, "I see the librarian decided to grace us with her presence after all." The thing is, they had no idea I'd spent the last 6 years visiting Grandpa Tom every other weekend. They didn't know about the Sunday morning pancakes in his kitchen while Ruby sat on his lap and he told her stories about the old days. They hadn't seen the workshop behind the estate where he'd carved an entire Noah's Ark for her birthday, each animal sanded smooth and painted with care that would have made any craftsman weep. They thought I'd abandoned the family when I married Isaac, a public school teacher whose father was a plumber and whose mother worked at the grocery store. In their world, I'd committed the ultimate sin by choosing love over legacy, authenticity over approval, happiness over the Brennan name. What Victor and Diane and their perfectly groomed children didn't know was that Grandpa Tom had called me his favorite. Not to my face, he wasn't the sentimental type, but Isaac had overheard him telling Leonard Walsh, the family attorney, during one of our secret visits. "That girl's got something the rest of them don't," Tom had said, his weathered hands running over a piece of maple he was turning into a rocking horse. "She knows what matters." My name is Claire Brennan, and for the past 6 years I've been the family disappointment. At 32, I've somehow managed to fail at everything that matters in the Brennan universe. I married wrong, choosing a 4th grade teacher who reads to his students with different voices for each character instead of a lawyer or doctor from an approved list. I work wrong, spending my days as a children's librarian in Burlington instead of managing the family timber business or marrying someone who does. I parent wrong, letting Ruby wear rain boots with sundresses and teaching her that kindness matters more than cocktail party conversation. The distance between Ashford and Burlington is only 45 minutes by car, but it might as well be different planets. Ashford is old New England money, where families like mine have lived since before Vermont was even a state. The Brennan Timber Company has been cutting sustainable lumber since the 1920s. Back when my great-grandfather Thomas Brennan Sr. bought his first tract of forest land and decided to do things right, to take only what could grow back, to think in generations instead of quarters. That philosophy built an empire worth over $4 million, and it made the Brennan name mean something in these parts. Burlington, where Isaac and I built our life, is different. It's a college town on the shores of Lake Champlain, full of artists and professors and people who measure success in different currencies. Our neighborhood has houses with rainbow flags and vegetable gardens in the front yard. Our daughter attends public kindergarten where the teacher plays guitar during circle time. We shop at the farmer's market on Saturdays and spend Sunday mornings making French toast while Ruby dances to whatever music Isaac puts on, usually something ridiculous that makes her giggle. I'd grown up at Maple Ridge Manor, the sprawling Victorian that has housed Brennan since 1892. 12 acres of pristine Vermont landscape, with the original carriage house converted into a 4-car garage, formal gardens that required 2 full-time groundskeepers, and rooms so numerous I discovered new ones well into my teenage years. My childhood bedroom had a walk-in closet bigger than Ruby's entire room now, and I'd had a bathroom to myself with marble counters and a clawfoot tub. But those rooms had always felt cold, no matter how high they turned up the heat. Conversations at dinner were about business deals and social obligations, never about dreams or fears or the small tender things that make a life worth living. My father Frank had died when I was 7, a logging accident that Victor never let anyone forget could have been prevented if proper protocols had been followed. After that, my mother Helen had sort of faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She went through the motions of being a Brennan wife and mother, attending the right events and saying the right things, but there was no light behind her eyes anymore. Victor, my father's older brother, had stepped into the role of family patriarch with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting in the wings his entire life. He'd always been father's shadow, the dependable one who understood that family legacy mattered more than personal happiness. When the company needed someone after my father's death, Victor was there. When the estate needed managing, Victor took over. When decisions needed to be made about my future, about my education, about what kind of life a Brennan daughter should lead, Victor had opinions that somehow became rules. I met Isaac at the Burlington Public Library 6 years ago. I'd just taken the job there, desperate to escape the suffocating expectations of Ashford and the constant reminders that I'd never measure up to Victor's vision of a proper Brennan. He'd come in looking for books about teaching reading to struggling students, and I'd spend an hour helping him navigate our education section. He had kind eyes and terrible jokes, and when he asked if I wanted to get coffee, I said yes before my brain could remind me that I was supposed to date men with trust funds and country club memberships. Our first date lasted 6 hours. We talked about everything, books and dreams and the kind of life we wanted to build. He didn't ask about my family's money or what connections I could provide. He wanted to know what made me laugh, what scared me, what I did at 3 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. When I told him I was a Brennan from Ashford, he nodded like it was just another fact about me, no more important than my shoe size or favorite color. Isaac proposed on a Tuesday morning in our apartment, no ring because we'd agreed to pick one out together. No elaborate plan because he said he'd woken up knowing he wanted to spend every morning for the rest of his life watching me drink coffee in my ridiculous oversized sweater. We got married at City Hall 3 months later, just us and 2 friends as witnesses. I'd called my mother to tell her, and the silence on the other end of the line had stretched so long I'd checked to see if the call had dropped. Claire, she'd finally said, her voice carrying that particular tiredness that had defined her since Dad died. Victor is going to be very disappointed. Not congratulations. Not I'm happy for you. Just a warning about Victor's disappointment, as if his feelings mattered more than my entire future. I'd wanted to scream that I didn't care about Victor's disappointment, that I'd spent 26 years caring about everyone's opinions except my own, that I was done living my life according to the Brennan family playbook. Instead, I'd said thank you for understanding and hung up before she could hear me cry. The fallout had been swift and brutal. Victor had called it a phase, a rebellion that would end when I came to my senses. Diane had actually laughed when I'd brought Isaac to a family dinner, her gaze sweeping over his off-the-rack suit and sensible Honda with barely concealed contempt. My cousins Marcus and Vanessa had treated us like we were amusing oddities, asking Isaac questions about his job with the kind of fake interest you'd show a child explaining their imaginary friend. So you teach 4th grade, Marcus had said, swirling bourbon in a crystal tumbler that probably cost more than Isaac's weekly paycheck. That must be very fulfilling. The emphasis on fulfilling had made it clear what he thought of fulfillment when compared to the serious business of making money and building empires. Vanessa had been even worse, suggesting that perhaps Isaac could transition into educational consulting or curriculum development for private schools, anything that sounded more impressive at cocktail parties than public school teacher. Grandpa Tom had been different. He'd shown up at our apartment unannounced 2 weeks after the wedding, carrying a box that contained his mother's china, the everyday set not the fancy one, and a handwritten note that said these are for building a life, not displaying one. He'd sat at our small kitchen table, had accepted Isaac's offer of store-brand coffee, and had spent 3 hours asking real questions about our plans and dreams. You picked a good one, he'd told me when Isaac had left to run an errand. He sees you for who you are, not what you represent. That's rarer than you'd think. Over the next 6 years, Tom had become our secret ally. He'd visit when Victor was traveling, spending weekends in our guest room that was really just a converted office with an air mattress. He'd been there when Ruby was born, holding his great-granddaughter with tears streaming down his weathered face, while Victor had sent a card with a check and a note about hoping we'd reconsider our lifestyle choices before it was too late. Tom had taught Isaac how to fish, had helped us plant our small vegetable garden, had shown up at Ruby's kindergarten graduation when Victor and Diane had been too busy with a charity gala in Boston. He'd carved toys for Ruby in his workshop, spent hours sanding and painting until each piece was perfect. A train set with 12 cars. A family of bears with articulated limbs. The Noah's Ark that Ruby slept with every night, 2x2 animals lined up on her shelf like wooden soldiers. "Don't tell Victor," he'd say with a wink. "Let him think I'm at the club." But Victor had found out anyway, or at least suspected. The questions had started about 6 months before Tom died, pointed inquiries about whether I'd been in contact with Grandpa, whether I was trying to manipulate an old man for my own benefit. I denied everything, protecting our secret visits with the same fierce determination I'd once used to hide contraband books under my childhood bed. Then 2 weeks ago, Tom's housekeeper had found him in his workshop. Heart attack, quick and painless according to the doctors. He'd been working on something, they said, a large piece covered with a tarp that no one had looked under yet. The funeral had been a spectacle, exactly the kind of production Tom would have hated. 300 people who knew the Brennan name but had never known the man who'd built it. I'd stood in the back of St. Catherine's Church with Isaac and Ruby, watching Victor accept condolences like he was already the patriarch, like he'd been the one who'd actually spent time with Tom in his final years. Diane had played the grieving niece with practiced precision, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus and Vanessa had worked the crowd, networking at their grandfather's funeral like it was a Chamber of Commerce mixer. Ruby had asked why we weren't sitting with the family, and I hadn't known how to explain that we weren't really considered family anymore, that I'd traded my seat at their table for the freedom to live authentically. Isaac had lifted her up so she could see the photos displayed at the front of the church, pictures of Tom through the decades, and I'd noticed that none of them included the last 6 years. Nothing of him with Ruby, nothing of the man he'd been when he'd finally let himself just be Grandpa instead of Thomas Brennan Sr., founder and patriarch. The wake at Maple Ridge Manor had been worse. I'd walked through rooms I'd grown up in, now feeling like a stranger in a museum. Victor had held court in the study, accepting sympathies and already talking about the business, about transitions and new directions. When I tried to pay my respects, he'd look through me like I was furniture, turning to speak with someone more important before I could even offer my condolences. It was Diane who'd finally acknowledged us, her smile sharp as cut glass. "Claire, how unexpected to see you here. And you brought your little family. How quaint." Ruby had hidden behind Isaac's legs, sensitive even at 5 to the coldness in Diane's voice. I'd wanted to leave right then, to take my daughter away from people who could make kindness feel like an insult, but something had kept me there. A feeling that Tom wouldn't have wanted me to run, that he'd want me to stand my ground even in hostile territory. Leonard Walsh had found me in the kitchen, where I'd escaped to help the catering staff clean up just to have something to do with my hands. He was 70 years old if he was a day, with silver hair and eyes that had seen 3 generations of Brennan family drama. He'd been Tom's attorney for 40 years, his friend for even longer, and one of the few people in Ashford who'd never treated me differently after I married Isaac. "Claire," he'd said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "I need you at my office Monday morning at 10. It's about your grandfather's will." "Victor already told everyone the reading is next month," I'd replied, confused. "After the estate is appraised and everything is sorted." Leonard's expression had shifted into something I couldn't quite read. "There are 2 wills, my dear. The one Victor knows about, and the real one." Tom was very specific about the timing and the attendees. He wanted you there before Victor started making plans that couldn't be undone. My heart had hammered against my ribs. 2 wills? "Monday at 10, he'd repeated, pressing a business card into my hand even though I'd known where his office was since childhood. "Bring Isaac," Tom insisted. "And Claire, don't tell Victor you're coming. Let it be a surprise." That conversation had been 3 days ago. I'd spent the weekend oscillating between hope and dread, wondering what Tom had done, terrified that Leonard had misunderstood or that this was some elaborate setup. Isaac had been steady as always, reminding me that Tom had loved me, that whatever happened on Monday, we'd face it together. Now here we were, standing in Leonard's conference room while Victor looked at us like we were stray dogs who'd wandered in off the street. The mahogany table stretched between us, a battlefield waiting for war to be declared. Diane had positioned herself in what she clearly considered the power seat, her designer handbag placed just so on the table like a declaration of territory. Marcus was checking his phone, probably texting about some business deal, while Vanessa examined her manicure with the bored expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. I wasn't aware the help were invited to will readings, Diane said, her gaze landing on Isaac with the warmth of a Vermont winter. Isaac is family, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My husband. Ruby's father. How could we forget? Victor finally looked up from his phone, his eyes cold. The great romance that was worth throwing away your heritage for. Tell me, Claire, does he even know how to tie a Windsor knot, or is that clip-on? Isaac's hand tightened on my shoulder, but his voice remained calm. It's a 4-in-hand, actually. I save the Windsor for special occasions. Like when my wife's family decides to acknowledge we exist. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ruby tugged on my skirt, and I bent down to her level. Mommy, why is everyone being mean? They're not being mean, sweetheart, I lied, because what else could I say? They're just sad about Great-Grandpa Tom. Great-Grandpa Tom wasn't mean when he was sad, Ruby said, her voice carrying in the silent room. He made me a puzzle instead. With my name on it. Are you BY? He said every letter was special, just like me. I saw Diane's expression flicker, something almost like shame crossing her features before the mask slid back into place. Victor, however, looked genuinely confused. Tom made you a puzzle? Lots of things, Ruby said proudly. A whole zoo. And a castle. And a train that really rolls. He kept them in his special workshop and said they were just for me because I was his favorite person to make things for. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor's face had gone an alarming shade of red, the vein in his temple pulsing visibly. You've been seeing Tom. Behind our backs. After everything we said about maintaining appropriate distance. I've been seeing my grandfather, I corrected. The man who actually wanted to know his great-granddaughter, who didn't care that her father teaches public school or that her mother chooses books over boardrooms. The man who loved us exactly as we are. You manipulative little, Victor started, but the door opening cut him off. Leonard Walsh entered, carrying a leather folder that looked older than I was. Behind him came 2 other people, a woman I recognized as Tom's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, and a younger man with a camera who positioned himself discreetly in the corner. Thank you all for coming, Leonard said, his professional demeanor firmly in place. Before we begin, I need to inform you that this reading is being recorded per Thomas Brennan's explicit instructions. What you're about to hear represents his final wishes, executed while he was of sound mind and body, witnessed and notarized according to Vermont state law. Leonard, what is this? Victor's voice had an edge I'd never heard before, something that sounded almost like panic. We agreed the formal reading would be next month after the appraisals. You assumed that, Leonard corrected gently. Tom had other plans. Now, if everyone would please take a seat, we have quite a bit to cover, and Tom was very specific about how this needed to unfold. We all sat, the scrape of chairs against hardwood loud in the tension. Ruby climbed into Isaac's lap, sensing that whatever was about to happen required her to be small and quiet. I reached for Isaac's free hand under the table, and he laced his fingers through mine, solid and warm and real. Leonard opened the folder, pulled out several documents, and began to read. I, Thomas Henry Brennan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils and declare this to be my last will and testament. Victor leaned back in his chair, confident again. This was familiar territory. He'd probably already spent Tom's money in his head, already made plans for expanding the business, already calculated how much more powerful the Brennan name would become with the full estate under his control. To my nephew Victor Brennan, Leonard continued, who has worked diligently to manage Brennan Timber Company for the past 20 years, I leave the sum of $100,000 and my gratitude for his service. The words hung in the air like smoke. $100,000. Not the business. Not the estate. Not the legacy Victor had spent 2 decades positioning himself to inherit. Diane's sharp intake of breath was audible. Marcus actually looked up from his phone. Vanessa's mouth had fallen open in a way that would have horrified her etiquette coach. That's impossible, Victor said, his voice strangled. The business, the estate, there must be a mistake. There's no mistake, Leonard said calmly. To my great-niece Vanessa Brennan and my great-nephew Marcus Brennan, I leave $50,000 each, to be used as they see fit. Grandfather, Vanessa found her voice, all pretense of boredom gone. You can't, we're family. Leonard continued as if she hadn't spoken. To my faithful housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who has cared for me and this house with dedication and kindness, I leave the sum of $200,000 and the contents of my personal library, which she has admired for many years. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears, her hand covering her mouth. I'd always liked her, the quiet woman who'd snuck me cookies when I was a child and had never once judged my choices as an adult. The remainder of my estate, Leonard's voice carried the weight of every word, including Maple Ridge Manor and all property therein, the full ownership of Brennan Timber Company, all financial assets, investments, and future proceeds, I leave to my granddaughter Claire Brennan Torres, with the stipulation that the business be held in trust for her daughter Ruby Torres until Ruby's 25th birthday, at which point Claire may choose to transfer ownership or maintain control as she sees fit. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Isaac's hand gripped mine so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. Ruby looked up at me with wide eyes, sensing something enormous had just happened even if she didn't understand what. Victor exploded out of his chair, sending it clattering backward. This is fraud. He was senile, manipulated by a gold digger who saw an opportunity to steal what rightfully belongs to this family. Sit down, Victor, Leonard's voice cut through the rage like a blade. Tom anticipated your reaction, which is why he insisted on the video recording and why he prepared a letter to be read aloud, explaining his reasoning. Unless you prefer to leave now and contest this in court, where Tom's very detailed documentation of his mental competency and your management of the company over the past 5 years will become public record. The threat landed like a physical blow. Victor remained standing but silent, his face cycling through shades of crimson and white. Diane had gone perfectly still, her social graces deserting her entirely in the face of financial ruin. Because that's what this was for them, I realized. They'd been living as if they already owned everything, spending against an inheritance they'd considered guaranteed. Leonard pulled out another document, this one in Tom's distinctive handwriting on his personal stationery. To my family, he began reading, and I use that term loosely for some of you. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and Leonard is doing exactly what I asked him to do, which is setting the record straight before Victor can do any more damage to what I spent 70 years building. I could hear Tom's voice in every word, that dry humor mixed with steel that had made him such a formidable businessman and such a wonderful grandfather. Victor, you've run Brennan Timber Company for 20 years, and in that time you've prioritized profit over sustainability, expansion over ethics, and your own comfort over the legacy I trusted you to protect. The forests I carefully managed for regeneration, you've harvested aggressively. The contracts I built on relationships and integrity, you've turned into transactions. The employees who gave us decades of loyal service, you've replaced with cheaper labor whenever possible. You turned something I was proud of into something I'm ashamed to put my name on. Victor's face had gone from red to a sick grayish color. Marcus and Vanessa were staring at their father like they'd never seen him before, which perhaps they hadn't, not this version stripped of power and pretense. Marcus and Vanessa, you've been raised to believe that money and status matter more than character and kindness. That's not your fault, that's your parents' failure, but you're adults now and responsible for your own choices. The modest inheritance you're receiving is more than most people see in a lifetime. What you do with it will show me whether you learned anything worth knowing. Vanessa's perfectly composed face crumpled. Marcus had the decency to look down at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Claire, Leonard continued, and I felt Isaac's arm come around me as my eyes filled with tears. My dear girl, you were the only one who understood what I was actually trying to build. Not a fortune, though I made one. Not a name that opens doors, though ours does. I was trying to build something that would outlast me, that would provide for families and communities for generations, that would leave the land better than I found it. Ruby had gone very quiet in Isaac's lap, sensing that this was important, that great-grandpa Tom was somehow speaking to us from wherever he'd gone. When you walked away from all of this to marry a good man and live an honest life, I was so proud I could barely stand it. You chose authenticity over approval, love over legacy, and in doing so, you proved you understood what actually matters. Isaac, if you're hearing this, thank you for seeing my granddaughter for who she truly is. Thank you for giving her the space to become herself instead of trying to shape her into something else. And Ruby, my darling girl, by the time you hear this recording, you'll be old enough to understand. Your great-grandfather loved you more than all the timber in Vermont. I was openly crying now, not caring that Victor could see, that Diane's disgust was palpable, that I was breaking every rule of Brennan composure I'd ever been taught. Isaac was crying too, and even Ruby had tears tracking down her small face, responding to the emotion even if she couldn't fully comprehend the words. The company is yours now, Claire, Tom's letter continued. Not because you wanted it or asked for it, but because you're the only one I trust to run it the way it should be run. With integrity. With sustainability. With the understanding that we're stewards of something larger than ourselves. You can sell it if you want. You can burn it down if that's what you think is right. But I'm betting you'll do something better. You'll fix what Victor broke. You'll restore what I built. And you'll teach Ruby that wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you give. Leonard set down the letter. There's more, but that's the essential message. Tom has left detailed documentation about the company's current state, including several questionable transactions and decisions made over the past 5 years that he'd been investigating before his death. He's also left recommendations for management changes, environmental restoration projects, and community investments he'd wanted to implement but was blocked from pursuing. This is insane, Victor found his voice, though it came out strangled. She knows nothing about running a timber company. She's a librarian married to a school teacher. They'll run it into the ground within a year. Actually, a new voice came from the doorway, and we all turned to see a man in his 50s, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt that had actually seen work, not the designer version people wore to look rustic. Claire's been learning about the business for 6 years. Tom made sure of it. Jack Morrison, Leonard made the introduction, though I recognized the name. Tom's foreman, the man who actually ran the day-to-day operations while Victor collected the credit. Tom asked me to be here for this. Said Claire would need someone who knows the business from the ground up, not just from the executive suite. Jack nodded at me with something like approval. Tom spent every other weekend teaching your wife about sustainable forestry, timber management, and the contracts we actually honor instead of the ones Victor reported to the board. She knows more about how this company really runs than Victor ever bothered to learn. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. I'd thought those weekends with Tom had been about spending time together, about him getting to know Ruby, about escaping the judgment and criticism that defined every interaction with Victor's side of the family. I hadn't realized he'd been preparing me, teaching me, slowly and carefully building my understanding of the business he'd spent a lifetime creating. The workshop, I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. All those hours while Ruby played with her toys and Isaac read in the corner. You weren't just showing me your woodworking projects. Jack smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. Tom had maps spread across every surface. Growth charts, sustainability reports, contracts dating back 40 years. He walked you through all of it, explained every decision, every compromise, every choice between profit and principle. He said you asked better questions than anyone he'd ever trained. Victor looked like he might actually have a stroke. You can't possibly expect us to just accept this. I'll contest it. I'll tie this up in court for years. That company is mine by right of the work I've put into it. The work you put into running it into ethical bankruptcy, Jack said, his voice hard. Tom documented everything, Victor. Every corner you cut, every safety protocol you ignored, every time you chose short-term profit over long-term sustainability. He showed it all to Claire. Taught her what he'd built and what you'd destroyed. Leonard pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker. Tom was thorough. He has documentation going back 5 years of decisions Victor made against his explicit instructions. Harvesting in restricted areas. violating contracts with the Abenaki Nation regarding sacred lands, intimidating employees who raised safety concerns, and most damning, falsifying sustainability reports to maintain certifications the company no longer qualified for. The color drained from Diane's face. This wasn't just about losing an inheritance anymore. This was about potential criminal liability, about the Brennan name being dragged through court proceedings and newspaper headlines, about their carefully constructed social standing collapsing like a house built on sand. If this goes to court, Leonard continued calmly, all of this becomes public record. Tom preferred to handle it privately, to give Victor the dignity of a quiet exit with enough money to live comfortably. But if you choose to contest this will, Victor, then we'll proceed with full disclosure, and I can assure you that $100,000 will seem generous compared to what legal fees and potential fines will cost you. Marcus stood abruptly. Dad, maybe we should talk about this. Maybe Mr. Walsh is right and we should just accept. Shut up, Victor snapped. You have no idea what you're talking about. This is about family legacy, about everything I've sacrificed to build. You didn't build anything, I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected. Grandpa Tom built it. You just lived off it while pretending the work was yours. And now you're angry because he saw through you, because he knew that given the choice between doing what's right and doing what's profitable, you'd choose profit every single time. You self-righteous little hypocrite, Diane finally found her voice, venom dripping from every word. Standing there in your thrift store clothes acting like you're better than us because you chose poverty over opportunity. You married down, you work a nothing job, and now you're being handed millions you didn't earn because you manipulated a lonely old man. My wife didn't manipulate anyone, Isaac's voice cut through the room with a teacher's authority, the kind that makes rowdy fourth graders snap to attention. She loved him. She brought our daughter to visit him. She listened to his stories and laughed at his jokes and saw him as a person, not as a bank account or a stepping stone to social status. That's not manipulation. That's called being a decent human being. You should try it sometime. Ruby, who'd been silent through most of this, suddenly spoke up in that clear voice children have before they learn to modulate for adult comfort. Great-Grandpa Tom said some people count money and some people count what matters. He said Mommy knew how to count right. The simple truth of it, delivered in a 5-year-old's unwavering certainty, seemed to break something in the room. Vanessa started crying, actual tears that ruined her carefully applied makeup. Marcus sat back down heavily, his head in his hands. Even Diane seemed to deflate slightly, her righteous anger running up against the reality that a child could see what she'd refused to acknowledge. Victor stood there, a man who'd built his entire identity on being the Brennan heir, on managing the family legacy, on wielding the power that came with the name. And in one afternoon, he'd lost it all, not to some corporate raider or hostile takeover, but to the granddaughter he'd dismissed as irrelevant, the one who'd chosen love over status and authenticity over approval. I'll be in touch with all of you regarding the specific logistics, Leonard said, closing his folders with a finality that felt like a gavel. Claire, I'll need you to come by the office later this week to sign papers and review Tom's recommendations for the company transition. Jack will remain as foreman, and Tom suggested several other key personnel who should be promoted to management positions. People who actually understand the business and share your grandfather's values. We stood to leave, Isaac carrying Ruby, who'd finally run out of the energy that had kept her still and quiet through the proceedings. As we reached the door, Victor's voice stopped us, and for the first time since I'd known him, he sounded less like the patriarch and more like a tired old man. He really taught you to run the company? All those weekends? I turned back to face him. He taught me what you never learned. That the business isn't about quarterly profits or shareholder value. It's about stewarding resources for the next generation. It's about the families who depend on those jobs, the land that depends on our choices, the future that depends on us doing this right. He taught me that wealth is responsibility, not reward. And he taught me that the Brennan name should mean something beyond just having money. We walked out into the crisp Vermont afternoon, the autumn air sharp and clean after the stuffiness of that conference room. Ruby wanted down, and we let her run ahead on the sidewalk, jumping in leaf piles with the unself-conscious joy of a child who hadn't yet learned to perform for audiences. Are you okay? Isaac asked quietly, his arm around my waist. I don't know, I admitted. I just inherited a $4 million company, a historic estate, and the responsibility of fixing everything Victor broke. Plus I'm pretty sure my entire extended family now hates me even more than they did before. They'll get over it, Isaac said. Or they won't. But Ruby will grow up knowing her great-grandfather trusted her mother to do something important. That matters more than whether Victor approves. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found photos, dozens of them, that must have been taken by Mrs. Chen over the past 6 years. Tom and Ruby covered in flour, baking something in the manor kitchen. Tom showing me forest maps in his workshop while I took notes. Isaac and Tom fishing off the small dock on the estate pond. Ruby asleep on Tom's shoulder in his favorite chair. All the moments Victor had assumed weren't happening, documented and preserved and now given to me as proof that love doesn't require approval to be real. The last photo was different. It showed the workshop wall, and written there in Tom's careful handwriting was a quote I recognized from Thoreau. Wealth is the ability to fully experience life. Below it, he'd added his own note. Claire knows this. That's why she gets everything. That's why she'll do better than I did. And that's why the Brennan name might finally mean something worth passing down. 3 months later, I stood in that same workshop, now converted into a planning center for the company's restoration initiative. Jack had charts spread across tables, showing which forest sections needed remediation, which contracts needed renegotiating, which communities we'd neglected under Victor's management. It was overwhelming and exhausting and exactly what needed to be done. Ruby was in the corner with a small workbench Tom had built for her before he died, carefully sanding a piece of pine under Jack's patient instruction. Isaac was meeting with our new HR director about implementing better benefits and safety training. And I was learning that running a timber company was both harder and more rewarding than shelving books at the library. We'd moved into Maple Ridge Manor, not because we needed the space or the prestige, but because Ruby should grow up in the house her great-grandfather had loved, running through rooms full of history and possibility. We'd turned half of it into company offices and the other half into an actual home, with toys scattered across priceless Persian rugs and Isaac's student artwork taped to walls that probably cost more to paint than our entire wedding had cost. Victor had taken the settlement in the end. The legal exposure was too great, and whatever pride he'd salvaged wasn't worth risking everything in court. He and Diane had moved to Florida, where they could rebuild their social standing among people who didn't know the full story. Marcus had actually apologized, sort of, saying he'd always known something wasn't right but hadn't known how to question his father. Vanessa had unfriended me on social media, which felt about right for how she processed disappointment. But Tom's real will, the one that mattered, wasn't written in legal documents. It was written in the lessons he'd taught me, the values he'd instilled in Ruby during those secret visits, the understanding that family isn't about blood or inheritance or maintaining appearances. It's about showing up. It's about seeing people for who they actually are. It's about choosing to count what matters instead of just counting money. And standing in that workshop, watching my daughter learn to shape wood with her hands while my husband planned better futures for families I'd never met, I finally understood what Tom had been trying to tell me all along. The real inheritance wasn't the company or the estate or the money. It was the freedom to build something meaningful, the responsibility to leave things better than I found them, and the knowledge that love, real love, doesn't require you to be anyone other than exactly who you are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.